Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. So, today we reach the final limb of Raja Yoga, that of Samadhi. Samadhi is the supreme attainment of Raja Yoga practice. And today I'm going to describe, as much as I can, what Samadhi is like and how it is experienced. So, how do we define Samadhi? Well, Samadhi is usually simply defined as the union of subject and object. Who is the subject? The subject is the meditator. What is the object? We're not just talking about any object at all, but a specific object, which is the divine nature at the root of all things, including of ourselves, which is what we truly are, and that is what we are uniting with when we enter Samadhi. So, previously in the Raja Yoga practice, we have been stripping away, peeling away the layers of our self, the individuated self, which believes that it is separate from the universe that it inhabits. And we began by stilling the mind and controlling the mind and silencing all of the thoughts and memories and ideas that we identify with, that we then aggregate together to create our personality or our self, which we find to be quite false actually. And that's been silenced, that has been subdued, and we've got a still, tranquil mind, but we still experience ourselves as separate from the rest of existence, because although the contents of our consciousness have been relatively emptied at this stage of the practice, and all of our consciousness is filled only with thoughts of heaven, of the divine, of God, nevertheless, we have a sense of subjective awareness left over. So we are still separated from the object of our practice. Now in the state of Samadhi, even that subjective awareness is shed, and there is no longer the distinction between experiencer and experienced. There is only an experience, and it is the experience of the divine. What do I mean by divine or God? Well, it's an experience of something limitless, eternal, without bound, something which is perfectly equanimitous, perfectly still and balanced and tranquil, which brings on a sense of bliss when we experience it. Bliss being a mixture of ecstasy or joy and relief. And that experience is also characterized by a sense of being in itself, pure being, not being dependent on this or that, not being defined in relation to this or that, but merely being in its own right. And the experience of Samadhi, the experience of that state, because it has no limit, because it has no conditions, because it is a state which exists only in reference to itself, and because it's a kind of experience which is very tautological, or it simply is because it is, what we find is that it is an experience that is complete. It is an experience that is perfect. It needs nothing else. Nothing needs to be added to Samadhi. Nothing needs to be taken away from it. It is simply perfection. Perfect tranquility, perfect joy, perfect bliss, perfect emptiness. But to try and explain Samadhi too much is to do it a disservice. Academic knowledge, academic explanations will not cut it in terms of describing Samadhi. It is something that one must experience for oneself, and only then can you truly understand it or comprehend what it is like. But there's a little bit more that we can say about Samadhi, and that is the categories of Samadhi. We can describe a little bit about that. So the consensus generally is that there are two states of Samadhi, two different levels of Samadhi. Some people add a third to that, and I'll discuss that later, but for the time being I want to focus on these two levels of Samadhi that are generally agreed upon. They are the lower level of Culpa Samadhi, that is to say, Samadhi containing form, and then above that there is the even higher attainment of Nerva Culpa Samadhi, which is Samadhi without form. And if you're familiar with Buddhist meditation or Buddhist theories about different states of consciousness, then maybe some of this terminology will sound familiar to you. It's very similar to the way that the Buddhist tradition categorizes the jhanas. These are the very advanced levels of meditation, the very advanced levels of attainment in meditation. There's 8 jhanas in total. The first 4 are the jhanas of form, and the last 4 above that are the formless jhanas. So it's possible that there has been some cross-pollination between the Raja Yoga developed by Patanjali and the Buddhist styles of meditation that emerged in very similar points in history and geographically in very similar sorts of areas of the world. So that's something to contemplate. But returning to Raja Yoga, there's Savakalpa and Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So to begin with, I'll describe Savakalpa Samadhi. So in Savakalpa Samadhi, what will have happened is you will have entered a very deep dhyana. That dhyana state will then develop into a state where you shed the distinction between subject and object, and there is that change in perspective, so that there's no division between subject and object anymore in your consciousness, or I should say, in consciousness. But nevertheless, there is still some, not so much thoughts, but there's subtle mental activity going on. There's very abstract sorts of colours or maybe even sounds going through consciousness. And some kind of rudimentary forms that inhabit the experience. Although there is this experience that is devoid of the distinction between subject and object, it is not completely limitless, because it is still contaminated, for lack of a better word, with some sort of form or some sort of vague kind of distinctions between different things. So that's Savakalpa Samadhi. It is still nonetheless a very beautiful experience. So once you've developed the ability to experience Savakalpa Samadhi, eventually, when you have an experience of Savakalpa Samadhi, you will find that that experience of Savakalpa Samadhi develops into an even higher form of Samadhi, which is Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And this is where, again, there's no distinction of subject and object. But now that rudimentary, subtle kind of form and movement, which was characteristic of the previous form of Samadhi, has disappeared. And now what you're faced with is an experience of, quite simply, an empty void. So there's no you, there's no environment, there's no light or sound, there's no temporality, there's no sense of time passing, there's no spatial sense or sense of things having any dimensions. It is simply empty. But of course, it's not empty in the sense of the vacuum of space. It is, in fact, an experience of the infinite. And you get that sense when you enter Nerva Culpa Samadhi. Although the mind doesn't really know how to process the experience of Nerva Culpa Samadhi. It doesn't really have the language to describe it. It is simply without form and void. Now, some people say that there is a third, even higher state of Samadhi, and that is the state of what is called Sahaja Samadhi. Supposedly, Sahaja Samadhi is a state where somebody has become so adept at entering Samadhi states at will. There's such an experienced meditator that entering Samadhi states has become so habitual to them that now they have permanently entered a state of Samadhi. They are always in Samadhi, 24/7. They are always absorbed in the divine. They are always one with the divine. And so the self has completely disappeared. And a person like this is said to be very, very close to achieving full enlightenment. Now, I have to say, I'm very skeptical about this form of Samadhi and its existence, and it could be because I've never experienced it, I've never verified it in my own practice, but it just seems like something that wouldn't really exist to me, or not really be attainable. If you think about the way that the mind works and the way that we experience this world, the mind is always changing. It's always changing states. The mind is never the same from one moment to the next, and indeed the world that we inhabit, the world, the substance of which we are comprised, is always changing from one moment to the next. And so long as we're not dead, we continue to inhabit this world, irrespective of the levels of consciousness that we've been able to attain. So how then could we possibly enter a state where our mind no longer changes and we're always in Samadhi? It just doesn't seem possible to me. But one thing that thinking about Sahaja Samadhi can be useful for is sort of underscoring the shortcomings or the limit of the Samadhi state that you can reach in the previous two forms of Samadhi. That is to say, when you enter a Samadhi state, it's not as though suddenly, you enter this state of Samadhi and the whole universe fills your head and completely transforms you in an instant and transmutes you and transfigures you into a new person so that you come out fully self-realized, fully enlightened as a kind of Buddha-like being who has had a completely radical personality change, as though they'd been struck by lightning. There's a misconception that that can be what happens during Samadhi. That's not what happens. When you enter a Samadhi state, the actual state itself will last, when you first experience Samadhi, it will last a few seconds if you're lucky. Then you sort of drop down into a lower state of meditation, and then eventually you come out of the meditation and you resume normal life, and you might feel very at peace, very unattached to anything, very unmoved by anything. And that could last for anywhere between half an hour to a few hours. Maybe if you're lucky, you can feel like that for a few days if you've got nothing else pulling you back into the world. But eventually that state fades away as well, and we resume the kind of consciousness that we have in our everyday lives. And so the only permanent change that entering Samadhi really has is that you discover that it is possible to enter such a state. And knowing that that is possible, it radically transforms your worldview. And there's certain experiences where once you've had them, you're not the same person. Your idea of what is possible in this world and what is important in this world has changed. And Samadhi is one of those experiences. But that is very different to, say, coming out of an experience and being a completely different person who's completely self-realized. That simply won't happen after just one Samadhi. There's much more work to do. But it is possible to, as you improve your meditation practice, more easily and readily enter states such as Samadhi, which can be very beneficial. It's all about making states of consciousness where we can get more peace and tranquility and see beyond the mind and beyond the narrow sense of self to something more eternal. That is really what we're trying to do in meditation. Now, as I've said previously in this video, Samadhi is not something that can be explained with dry language. It's something which has to be experienced to be understood. I have experienced both Culpa and Nerva Samadhi. I've been practicing Raja Yoga since 2017, and I've experienced both of those states in my practice. And I can't, unfortunately, plug my consciousness into a computer and download that experience into your mind so that you can know what it's like. Perhaps we'll have the technology to do that one day, but it's not today. So the best that I can do is tell you a story, tell you the story of what it was like when I entered Culpa Samadhi and when I entered Nerva Samadhi, and maybe that will make it a bit more relatable. Maybe it'll make it a bit easier to understand what the experience is like. I've kept meticulous journals for as long as I've been a serious spiritual practitioner, so it'll be very easy for me to find the journal entries that I have about Samadhi and put together a video where I share those experiences with you. So that's coming up. Something a bit different to perhaps what you're used to on this channel. Much more of a story type format, so we'll see how we go with that. So that was my video explaining Samadhi in a nutshell. The basics of Samadhi. If you enjoyed this video and you want more like it, and you want to be alerted as soon as new videos are released on this channel, subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. And if you have any experiences that you would like to share about your views on Samadhi, have you entered a Samadhi state before? Please leave your comments down below. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.